Do you know anything about Afghanistan's history?
Nope. Do you?
Nope. Just as well that today we're reviewing Pax Pamir 2nd edition, a board game all about the conflict in 19th century Afghanistan known as the Great Game. Shall we go and learn?
Yeah, let's go and do a learn.
This is the Palace of Westminster, which is obviously not Afghanistan, but A, we can't really afford to go to Afghanistan, and B, for the purposes of reviewing Pax Pamir, it is fairly reasonable to say that the conflict depicted in it started right here. Sometime in the early 19th century, Britain, from here onwards referred to as Imperial Estate Number 1, controlled a chunk of Asia and its resources. At that same time, Russia, we'll call it Imperial Estate Number 2 just to distinguish them a little bit, held control of another chunk of Asia and its resources. Meanwhile, a dynastic struggle was already taking place in Central Asia, a space between Imperial Estate 1 and 2's holdings, and the decisions of a few men in suits somewhere in the offices of this building forever warped that conflict. This is, of course, an oversimplification, but thus started centuries of paranoia, proxy wars, and puppet governments. Officially, the Great Game ended on the 10th of September 1890, but that is just a relative marker for peace that not everyone was happy about. And one does not need to look far back into history to know that peace in Afghanistan is perhaps the most precious commodity.
You know, I honestly didn't expect things to get so heavy in a board game review.
I know, but this is a game with a heavy subject, and thus it deserves its due diligence. But Pax Pamir is still very much a board game, so let me tell you, what about it has captured my imagination? It would be reasonable to assume, with Pax Pamir being a war game, or as I've been schooled by my wargaming friend, more accurately, a consim, meaning conflict simulator, and having pieces representing the armies of Imperial Estate 1, 2, and also Afghanistan, that will be taking control of one of those armies and deploying them on the map.
Wait a minute, are these real? Are these actual board game components?
Yes, it's very pretty, but look, I'm trying to tell people about the complicated... Do you know what? Just tell people about your thing.
Have you ever played a game with a cloth board before? Probably not, unless you've been playing traditional board games from East Asia. And let me tell you now, you have been missing out. Aesthetics are one thing, but there is something so delightful in rolling out something this beautiful. I can practically hear the history woven into the fabric. Oh wait, no, that's just affordable Chinese manufacturing. Efka, you can do your bit now.
Ah, yes, the subversion. Nothing I've expected from Pax Pamir came to fruition. The more I've learned about Afghanistan's history, the more I felt like I knew less than when I began. At first I thought the image seemed clear. Two colonial forces vying for the control of a key territory, except it was less to do with countries and more to do with companies, in the same way that in the future you might have the Samsung versus Google wars, except that companies are far too smart to brand wars after themselves, except it was also about countries. And the more I read, the more conflicts and contradictions I found, including from the information sent to me by the designer of this game himself, Cole Worley, who is not only an academic, but spent 3 years studying this subject. It reminds me of Adomas Mickiewicz, a famous Lithuanian poet who was also Adam Mickiewicz, a famous Polish poet, if you ask anyone who's Polish, and famous Belarusian poet, if you ask anyone who's from Belarus. And once again, it turns out that the truth is more complicated than any of those versions. Which brings us to the game itself, where one might expect a stuffy war game with blocks and complicated rules about movement based on which direction the wind is blowing and what the soldiers had for dinner that day. Instead, refreshingly, you take on the role of Afghani warlords who are desiring to bend the conflict for their own advantage. And imagine my delight when I read in the rulebook that the word for these invading foreigners is in fact Ferengi. Yes, the idiot space goblins from Star Trek came much later, but that just reinforces the imagery. Okay, baby gloves are off, get ready for quite a hefty rules explanation. At the start of each game, each player will pick a faction they are allied with. Any combination is fine here, and more importantly, any combination is potentially very interesting. In a three-player game, two players could be allied with the British, one player allied with Afghanistan, and no one allied with the Russians. Alternatively, all three players could be allied with the Russians and no one else, and neither is wrong and neither is static. But let's pivot for a second. This is the game's card market, and each time your turn comes along, you can essentially do one of three things. Either buy a card into your hand, paying a coin for each card you skip along the track, play a card from your hand, or activate one of the bonus actions available on the cards you've played, once again paying the cost. Don't get greedy, you can only do two things. Here's the trick. 4 times per game, a dominance card will appear. Imagine this as a speedy locomotive, except you're tied to the tracks and there is no Superman, because at any point during the course of the game, any player can just pay the money and purchase this, aka push the pedal to the metal. As soon as this card resolves, one of the game's 4 scoring phases will commence. With me so far? Okay, there's levels to this alliance business. Just by being loyal to that faction, you have one influence with them. But if you have agents of that faction, that's more influence for each of them. If you dispatch an enemy of said faction, that is extra influence. And finally, if you're going to give gifts to that faction, more influence. You get the idea.
Alright, I have all the influence I will ever need. Do I win the game now?
No, you are loyal to the Russians, and currently it's Afghanistan that is dominant because they have 4 more roads and or armies than anyone else. And influence is only important if your faction is dominant when dominance is checked.
But I don't understand. I have all these people here I have murdered. That has to be good for something?
Well, that's the central conundrum. Each time dominance is checked, out of the people who are loyal to the dominant faction, the person with the most influence will score 5 points, second most will score 3 points, and third most will score just a measly point.
I understand. I get it. How did you say I scored points again? I'm kidding. I get it. Not only do I get it, I think this is potentially genius. Imagine this. Vagabond has an allegiance to Russia, Porg has a loyalty to the British, and Turtle here has an allegiance to Afghanistan. Currently there are more Afghan blocks on the map than anyone else. Porg could spend time and resources populating the map with more armies, and inevitably everyone else will follow suit. Or Porg could do the smart thing, jump ship and change allegiance to Afghanistan and leave poor Turtle here in the dirt. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. Pax Pamir is essentially a game of shifting betrayals. If I share an allegiance to the British with another player, then technically we have mutual interests. By buying and playing cards that put armies and roads on the map, we're furthering each other's chances of scoring points. But it's still a competition because that person is not me. I don't want them to win. I want me to win. All this time that I've been helping myself, I've also been helping them. And that means I need to betray them. But you know what? That sucker over there, they're thinking exactly the same thing. Finally, this conundrum is rounded out by a couple of design tweaks that really make it sing. First, if no faction is dominant, then players will still score points, except now it's the player who has deployed the most discs, and the amount of points they score will be fewer. Imagine yourself in an utterly unwinnable position. 2 dominant factions are vying for control, and neither of those factions is yours. You could change allegiance to the one that is going to win and eat the table scraps because of your negligible influence, or you could join the underdog and shift into a position where no faction is dominant, and then you would be the only one feasting on those tasty, tasty victory points. Of course, we've saved the best for last. The final dominance card will always score double points, making sure that no matter what position you're in, this is still anyone's game, but also opening up this system to some seriously devious machinations. In my first game of Pax Pamir, I was on 0 points. Not only was I losing, but I was stuck with a faction that had absolutely no board presence. What everyone didn't realise though was that all the members of my court were the enemy of the dominant faction, so I killed them. All of them. This not only switched my allegiance automatically, but it now meant I was the most influential in the dominant faction, scoring me a whopping 10 points and putting me in the lead.
Wait, did you just do the Red Wedding in a board game?
I did better than that. I did the Red Wedding and I won. You know what they say, in a game of Pax Pamir, you either Pax or you Pamir.
That makes no sense.
I know.
From a purely ludological perspective, Pax Pamir has got a fantastic premise supported by a very clever design. Let's look at points, for example. In most games, points are a measure of our achievement, as if some sort of a... Do you know, I'm just not gonna go there. Seriously though, when I play a Euro game such as Great Western Trail, points show me how well I've done, as opposed to another player or as opposed to another play. It's the yardstick of the effectiveness of my efficiency. In Pax Pamir, whether you come second or fifth or third is meaningless because points are a representation of the opportunity seized at the right time with the right tools. Effectiveness matters, but only marginally. In Pax Pamir, you see the trappings of your game, such as that card selection mechanism where you place a coin on every undesirable card you pass, creating little piles of treasure that eventually become too tempting not to snap up. Look at this William Hay McNagathan. McCanathan. Mackenzie. It's a chump in a top hat. He's from the East India Company. He is an administrative failure. It says so right here. Who would want him? But look, he comes with 4 rupees. Go on then. Take the chump. All the cards having multiple uses. Each time you play one, you resolve every ability on the top right corner. This could place armies on the map or roads these armies could walk through, advancing your faction towards dominance, or spies on enemy cards or tribes on the map that later help you control the region, which I am so aware we've gotten nowhere near to actually explaining yet, but oh, there's so much more. Like each card having loyalty. You play it, you change loyalty, which could be amazing or terrible, depending on the situation. Each card could make you feel like a proud victory pug or a hapless puppy being dragged away from their parents. But then those cards become a tableau of abilities. You could build more armies, you could kill enemy armies, you could kill enemy cards, you could tax other players, indulgently helping yourself to their money. And once again, it's easy to view this as a Eurogame because we've trained ourselves to think that something that looks like this is code for a suite of powers and abilities that we like and get to keep. It is anything but. This is an ever-changing tableau of characters that reinvents itself faster than a Shakespearean comedy. It's actually ingenious to see how many different ways there are of murdering things, including some rules that are pretty easy to forget. For example, Elaine, did you know that if I murdered your last tribe in Punjab, I would also murder all of the cards that you have with the Punjab location?
What? That's all of them?
Yes.
I'm pretty sure that's not a rule in the game.
It is, in fact, a rule. It says so right here in the rule book in page 8.
I said I'm pretty sure that is not a rule in the game.
Okay, yeah, that is not a rule in the game.
The problem with Pax Pamir, and I don't see this being a problem for everyone, is in the minutiae. Let me get something clear. In the sphere of wargames, and even in the Pax series, of which there are many, we are very much novices. But this is useful because Pax Pamir 2nd edition is meant to be the most streamlined and the most accessible. The idea behind the Pax series is that they are a political thesis based on historical events, but they are also a simulation and therefore can play out unpredictably. And because they are opening themselves up to new audiences, and if you are a part of that, then you might want to hear this perspective, especially from someone who's so well versed in board game critique. It's easy to admire Pax Pamir, but it's equally easy to be frustrated by it. Let's examine a card again. Each card will have actions that are triggered when you play them, actions available to you after you've played them, with some potentially having static abilities. Its loyalty, its location, its influence reward for murdering it its suit and an amount of stars that will give you benefits based upon that suit. And let's not forget the historical flavour text. All of those, apart from that last one, are game affecting, and as much as we like to think of ourselves as information passing savants, when it comes down to the reality of picking 1 or 2 cards from a roster of 12 with varying costs, we are far more likely to pick the one that has an effect that we want and file the rest away as circumstantial. That in itself is fine, perhaps even exciting. We want games that surprise us and give us those gotcha moments. But Pax Pamir is so unpredictable that it feels like it runs around and stabs itself in the back. One of the game's rules that is cool is breaking one of the tenets that you only get 2 actions per turn. That is still true, but at any point one of the suits will be dominant, either diplomacy, politics, economy, or warfare. If, say, diplomacy is the dominant suit, any card that you have that matches that suit will give you 1 extra action in addition to that 2 action limit. It's fun to imagine a conflict shift, all parties vying for a diplomatic solution. Nobody wants to fight and everyone is just trying to resolve the matter with words. Suddenly a mysterious figure enters the debate, tainting everything with a malign intent, and all those words turn into S-words. Swords. You might have a good roster of economic cards and spot a card that will allow you to change the suit to economic, allowing you for delightful scheming and manipulations. But the board state is so convoluted that you might not be able to afford it, or it might change your allegiance, which could be capital BAD, or even if you've invested yourself into buying and playing that card, someone might just change the dominant suit straight back after your turn. Imagine investing time and resources into buying a card and hoping to play it on the next turn, only to find that someone has revealed and paid for an event that locks the dominant suit. Or, better yet, murders your entire court.
So essentially Pax Pamir is a game of shifting allegiances.
Yeah.
And to do well, you need to be able to seize the opportunity at the right time.
Yes.
But the problem with that is that it's so flowing and unpredictable that it flies past you like a mad albatross.
Yes.
And this is the end of the critique because this video has gone on for far too long already?
Oh my no.
Elaine is right, there's more, but this is not your average game and it deserves thoroughness. And I am a good man and thorough. This buoyancy is highly dependent on player count. A 2-player game reduces the cleverness of this central conceit, but turns the unpredictability of the game into a cat and mouse show-off, whereas a 5-player game is a disaster on stilts in the middle of the sea during a thunderstorm. And in some regards, that's okay. This is a simulation, you are the variable, and the output is appropriately wild. Pax Pamir is like no game I've ever seen before, tantalizing with delicious possibility, even when you know that 2/3 into the game you've made 1 wrong move and you are stuck there for another half an hour pushing against the tidal wave of cardboard history. I do, however, wish it was a cleaner design. In some cases, it's wonderful. At a mere glance, you can tell which faction is dominant, who's got more discs out, and that's vital because if you can't tell who's winning, then the game is a mess, and that's another goal in the 5-player net. In other cases, it's so unforgivingly simulationist that it prefers specificity within rules to the point where, and I hate to use the F word, it's no longer fun. To do the tax action, for example, which could just be take some coins from people. First, you need to rule a region. Then you need to check for cards that your opponents have that match that same region. Then you can tax those and only those opponents. But first you need to check whether they have any economic cards with stars that act as a buffer. Then you can tax them. Or you can alternatively tax the market, but you don't need to rule any region to do that. Remember all of that? Well, of course you do, because I've just told you, but you remember all of the other rules I've taught you in this video. And now consider that I've only told you the specific rules for one of the 6 bonus actions, which seem to be not at all cohesive in terms of rules with each other. But no discussion of Pax Pamir can be complete without delving into politics, and if you happen to be one of the people who are crying for politics to be left out of board games, You are really barking up the wrong dead tree here. Pamir is not the only game in the Pax series. Originally designed by Phil Eklund, a man who's argued for climate change denial, and in the first edition of Pax Pamir included an essay titled "In Defense of Colonialism." Yep. But Pax Pamir is not designed by Phil Eklund, it's designed by Cole Worley, whom you might recognize from Everyone's Darling Root. I've spoken to Cole about the infamous essay, and my discussions have revealed that not only was he opposed to having that essay included, but that he saw it as completely inapplicable. He wanted Pax Pamir to be a game that bucked the trend of putting the colonists in the glorified front and center. And I don't need to believe Cole to know that it's true, and everything I've told you about the game should reinforce that. These aren't British soldiers, for example. They could be loyal to the British, but the perspective is local, not invading. And the second edition is no longer published by Phil Eklund's publishing company Sierra Madre Games and is absent of that essay. In fact, the original edition of the game was supposed to have a counterpoint essay written by Cole Worley, which was sadly eventually excluded. None of this, of course, dismisses the fact that that first game was published and then that essay exists, nor the fact that Cole, in his own admission, did concede to its publishing. And that's not the only problem with Pax Pamir. Whilst the inclusion of a slave market cards in a game with a historical setting is a lot more appropriate than in, say, Five Tribes, which for all intents and purposes is an abstract game that has nothing to say, at least a sensitivity warning in the rulebook would have been appreciated. And some of the artwork on the cards in this game is, shall we say, suspect. Ultimately, Pax Pamir's politics are as complex and convoluted as the game itself, and I've given you just a starting point to begin untangling it. And whilst it might sound like we're being dismissive of the game, I have to admit that we've never played anything like this, and I can't stop thinking about it. Everything from its unparalleled core conundrum to the unrelenting simulationism is an uncompromising vision, and I think everything it sacrifices, it does so knowingly. And for every person that's annoyed by its overbearing nature, there's going to be another person enraptured by its ideas. And as for us, well, we have the same conclusion as at the end of our root review. We can't wait to see what designer Cole Worley gets up to next. Look, I'm wearing a different shirt now because this video took so long to make that I had to change clothes. And that's okay because these videos are enabled by you, our Kickstarter backers. And some people have expressed a wish to donate even though the Kickstarter is over, and you can do so via nopunincluded.com/donate and support more of this kind of work that's in depth, but also doesn't just tell you whether a game is amazing or terrible, but actually helps you make up your mind. A couple of other things: if you wanted a differing take on Pax Pamir, then I recommend an article from spacebiff.com by Dan Thurrett. Another thing, I wanted to thank our friend Ross Connell, who helped us film a few of these scenes. If you want to check out his website, it's More Games Please, and he does amazing interviews with board game artists. Finally, Rodney, this one is for you.